Sophie faces her family's betrayal at a charity gala, a powerful family story Reddit. In today's story, we dive into the life of Sophie Montgomery, a successful woman who faces the ultimate test of resilience and inner strength. At a glamorous charity gala hosted by her husband, Sophie unexpectedly reunites with her estranged sister, Lily. What follows is a confrontation that will challenge everything Sophie has worked for. Will she rise above the past, or will the weight of family betrayal drag her down? Stay with us till the end to find out. If you enjoy this story, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel, Silent Wars, for more inspiring content. The grand ballroom at the Lakeside Mansion Resort stretched out before Sophie Montgomery, its luxurious expanse bathed in the glow of crystal chandeliers. The glittering lights reflected off the marble floors, casting an almost surreal sheen over the room. A sense of wealth and power permeated the air, so thick that it felt almost tangible. It was a world she had once dreamed of, a world that now seemed so far removed from the life she had chosen for herself. As Sophie walked into the room, she couldn't shake the tight knot of unease building in her chest. The evening felt out of place, like a well-rehearsed play where she no longer remembered her lines. She didn't belong here, but there was no turning back now. Her husband, Dr. Alexander Brooks, sensed her discomfort and placed a steadying hand on the small of her back. His touch was gentle, reassuring, and Sophie appreciated it, even if it couldn't entirely ease her mind. His presence, calm and unwavering, anchored her in a way that the glittering opulence around them could not. Sophie took a deep breath, trying to collect her thoughts, but as the noise of the event swelled around her, her mind wandered to the past, the life she had left behind to build something entirely her own. "This is your night," Alexander murmured quietly, as if reading her thoughts. "We've earned our place here." Sophie nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips, but the truth felt like a bitter pill. She had worked so hard to get here, but there was a nagging voice inside her head that kept whispering about the life she had walked away from. The grand ballroom, the glittering guests, the wine flowing like rivers, it was all a far cry from the life she had once known. A life of struggle, uncertainty, and loneliness. Her thoughts were interrupted by a small tug at her side. Sophie looked down to find her son, Ethan, adjusting his bow tie, a frustrated look on his face. At just 8 years old, Ethan was already proving himself to be the charming and witty child he had always been, but tonight, he was clearly uncomfortable. His bow tie had become a source of irritation, and Sophie couldn't help but smile at his antics. "Mom, this thing is trying to choke me," Ethan grumbled. Sophie knelt down beside him, adjusting the bow tie with practiced hands. "Just for a little while, buddy. Remember the deal, good behavior now, pool time later," she whispered, offering him a wink. Ethan's eyes lit up with the promise of swimming, and for a moment, the tension Sophie had been feeling seemed to ease. But as she stood up, something in the crowd caught her eye. Across the ballroom, she saw a familiar face, a face that froze her in place. It was a profile she knew all too well, the tilt of the head, the way the lips curved when she laughed, the tilt of her gaze. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. It had been years 11 to be exact, but her body recognized it instantly. There, across the room, was Grace, her estranged sister. Sophie's hand trembled around her champagne flute, the only outward sign of the storm raging inside her. She hadn't expected this, hadn't prepared for it. The sudden appearance of Grace, with her poised elegance and effortless beauty, shattered Sophie's composure. She hadn't seen her sister since that night, since everything had fallen apart. Her eyes met Grace's across the room, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. Grace, raising her champagne glass in a toast, locked eyes with Sophie. And then, the world seemed to shift. The hushed conversations around them faded into the background, and all Sophie could hear was the thudding of her own heart in her chest. In that instant, Sophie was reminded of everything she had tried to leave behind. She could feel the shame, the pain, the memories of the years she had spent running from her family's expectations, from their rejection. Yet, standing here now, she wasn't the same person. Sophie was no longer the girl who had been cast aside in favor of her sister's brilliance. Sophie had become a woman who had built her life from nothing, and she wasn't about to let Grace, or anyone else, take that away from her. As the silence stretched, Sophie gathered herself, her composure settling over her like armor. She could feel Alexander's reassuring hand on her back once again, his presence grounding her. It was time to face this moment, to face the family she had left behind. Sophie straightened up, her voice steady as she caught Grace's eye once more. She raised her glass in a silent toast, offering a quiet acknowledgement. No words, no accusations, just a simple gesture. Grace's face faltered at the unexpected recognition. And Sophie? She was ready. Ready to stand tall in the face of everything that had tried to tear her down. Sophie Montgomery stood in the heart of the Lakeside Mansion Resort, her mind racing in a blur of emotions as the evening unfolded around her. The soft hum of the crowd, the clinking of glasses, the laughter that seemed to echo across the ballroom, all of it felt distant to her. She had expected the night to be challenging, navigating the glittering world of her husband's high society colleagues, but nothing had prepared her for the moment that came next. There, standing across the room, was a face she hadn't seen in over a decade. Her heart skipped a beat, her breath catching in her throat. It wasn't just anyone, it was Lily, her estranged younger sister. Sophie's eyes narrowed as she watched Lily laugh joyfully with a group of guests. The familiar tilt of her head, the way she threw her head back when she laughed, it was all so painfully familiar. But it was also different. Gone was the girl who had once shared the same childhood memories, replaced by the woman standing before her now, radiating the kind of confidence that Sophie hadn't seen in years. A wave of shock hit Sophie. The jolt of recognition sliced through her like a bolt of lightning. It had been so long since they last spoke, since everything between them had shattered beyond repair. The weight of that history settled over her in an instant, heavy and suffocating. The sight of Lily, so effortlessly at ease in this glamorous setting, stirred up a flood of memories. Memories Sophie had buried deep inside her, memories of betrayal and abandonment, of a family that had turned its back on her in favor of her sister. Sophie felt a cold knot form in her stomach. The smile that had once come so naturally to her now felt foreign, a mask she no longer recognized. How could things have turned out this way? How had she allowed herself to be pushed aside, made to feel invisible in her own family, all for the sake of Lily's perceived perfection? The hurt, the anger, and the confusion that Sophie had carefully kept locked away for years began to surface. She had always been the strong one, the one who picked herself up and moved forward. But seeing Lily again made everything feel raw, like an old wound that had never truly healed. Curiosity mingled with her growing unease. Sophie could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy, as she continued to watch her sister interact with the guests. Her heart beat faster, each pulse ringing in her ears as the storm brewing inside her intensified. Was Lily even aware of the weight of the past between them? Did she know what had been taken from Sophie? What she had cost her, both emotionally and financially? Then, it happened. Their eyes met across the room. For a split second, everything around them seemed to fade. Time seemed to stretch, and Sophie felt the air between them grow taut with unspoken words. The silence between them wasn't just the absence of sound, it was a wall, a chasm of years filled with lies, silence, and unresolved tension. Sophie felt her breath catch in her throat, the tension palpable as the distance between them seemed to shrink. She wanted to walk over, confront her sister, demand answers. She wanted to expose the betrayal, to bring to light the truth that had been hidden for so long. But something inside her, something stronger than the anger and the hurt, told her to hold back. The silence between them spoke louder than any words could. The guests around them continued to mingle, oblivious to the quiet storm brewing between the sisters. But Sophie knew. She knew that the moment her eyes locked with Lily's, everything had changed. The years of distance, of pretending to forget, had melted away. The past had returned, uninvited and unresolved, but Sophie wasn't sure she was ready to face it yet. For now, all she could do was stand there, her heart heavy with the weight of history, watching as her sister turned away, a smile still plastered on her face, but something in her eyes had shifted. The storm between them was far from over. The grand ballroom of Lakeside Mansion Resort was filled with laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the soft hum of conversations. But for Sophie Montgomery, it felt like the walls were closing in. Her breath caught in her throat as she took a step toward Lily, her estranged sister, still standing across the room with the same charming smile that Sophie had known since childhood. She had to speak to her, had to confront the years of silence, the lies, and the betrayal that had separated them. But before she could take another step, her mother's sharp voice cut through the air, louder than any music or conversation. "What are you doing here?" The words hissed, venom lacing them. Sophie froze, her body tense as the familiar sting of shame coursed through her. The room seemed to pause, every head turning in her direction, and the whispers began low at first, then rising like a wave. "Is that her sister? What happened between them? Why is she even here?" The murmurs spread quickly like wildfire, igniting a small storm of questions and curiosity. Sophie stood frozen, momentarily paralyzed by the weight of the old wounds her mother's words had reopened. For a split second she was a child again, standing in the rain with nothing but a suitcase and a heart full of unspoken questions. She had been abandoned, disregarded, and made to feel less than. And now, as an adult, she felt the same rush of shame flood her chest. But Sophie wasn't that vulnerable girl anymore. She was stronger, more resolute. She had built herself up from nothing, rising above the years of silence and rejection. Just as her mother's voice began to pierce the tension in the air again, Sophie felt a steadying hand on her back. Her husband, Dr. Alexander Brooks, stood beside her, calm and unwavering. His presence, firm and reassuring, immediately cut through the rising storm of tension. He took a small step forward, his voice carrying an air of authority that silenced the room. "She's with me," Dr. Alexander's voice rang out, steady and unshaken. "Sophie is my wife. She's a guest here." The words were simple, but they carried weight. He was the surgeon, the respected man who had earned his place in this world, and he wasn't about to let anyone challenge his wife. His calm demeanor was a sharp contrast to the growing frenzy around them. Sophie felt the tension in the room shift. For a brief moment she was ready to let the whispers wash over her. But then, just as her mother began to open her mouth again, she noticed something, a change in the air. The whispers that had been so full of judgment were replaced by something else, something much sharper. Eyes that had once looked down on Sophie now shifted in her direction with a new kind of recognition. She was no longer the girl who had disappeared from her family's life. As if on cue, Lily was introduced to the crowd as the golden child, the shining success story of their family. She was a high-flying surgeon, a medical prodigy, the one who had always been praised, always been adored. But Sophie couldn't help but notice the discomfort in the air as her sister's achievements were lauded. There was a moment of quiet, almost disbelief, as Lily was praised for her accomplishments. But in the midst of it, something unexpected happened. Sophie's name was brought up in the same conversation, almost by accident. A passing comment about Sophie's involvement in groundbreaking medical technology, her success with Medova, and her reputation as a trailblazer in post-surgical recovery. The words hung in the air like a revelation, like the shifting of the earth beneath her family's feet. The faces around the room shifted, confusion and surprise replacing the pity that had once defined her. Sophie had become the woman her family had never thought she could be. The woman they had cast aside was now a powerful force in her own right. Sophie didn't need to say anything. The shock on her parents' faces was enough. Their eyes, once filled with judgment and superiority, now darted nervously between her and Lily. Sophie stood tall, refusing to let the whispers or the past control her anymore. The once overpowering shame was replaced by something far stronger: pride. She had earned her place here, and she wasn't going to let anyone, least of all her family, define her anymore. She held her ground, her posture unwavering as the whispers grew louder. She didn't back down. Instead, she watched, a quiet strength settling within her, as her family's facade began to crack. The room was still humming with the low chatter of guests, but Sophie could feel the shift in the atmosphere. Her sister Lily, the golden child of the family, had been basking in the spotlight, enjoying every moment of the attention directed her way. But as Sophie's accomplishments began to ripple through the conversation, something changed. It wasn't the kind of recognition Sophie had imagined, but it was enough to turn the tables. A woman in the crowd, an experienced medical professional, stepped closer to Sophie. Her eyes lit up with recognition as she scanned Sophie's name badge. "Wait a minute," she said, her voice raising slightly in surprise. "You're the CEO of MedTech Solutions?" The question hung in the air, drawing the attention of several others nearby. Sophie nodded politely, her calm demeanor at odds with the rush of satisfaction flooding her. "Yes," Sophie replied simply, her voice smooth. "We specialize in surgical recovery technology. Our system has been implemented in over 50 hospitals across the country now." The conversation around her shifted as more people took notice of the name MedTech Solutions. Sophie didn't need to explain any further. The reactions in the room spoke volumes. The whispers grew louder as medical professionals began to connect the dots. MedTech Solutions was a rising star in the healthcare field, revolutionizing post-surgical care, and Sophie had built it from the ground up, despite everything her family had thrown her way. Sophie couldn't help but feel a rush of satisfaction, but it wasn't just from the recognition. It was the sweet taste of vindication that she had earned. For years, Sophie had been dismissed, belittled, and overlooked by her family. They had painted her as a failure, someone who would never amount to anything. But now, as the weight of her success settled over her like a comforting cloak, she realized just how much she had accomplished. The recognition from the crowd, the respect that came with the title of CEO, was all she needed. But there was one more thing. Sophie turned her gaze back to Lily, who stood across the room, her smile faltering as the shift in the room's energy reached her. Sophie watched as her sister's carefully crafted composure began to slip. The years of lies, the image Lily had so carefully constructed for herself, were starting to unravel in front of everyone. Sophie could see the fear behind Lily's eyes, the panic setting in as she realized that Sophie had just inadvertently exposed the cracks in the story she had built. Lily had always been the one to thrive under the illusion of perfection. Now, that illusion was crumbling. Sophie could have pointed out the discrepancies, could have told everyone about the lies Lily had fed their family for years, the stories of her high academic achievements, the years spent pretending to be the family's shining star. But Sophie didn't need to do that. She didn't need to expose Lily's deception in front of the entire room. Instead, Sophie walked over to her sister, her footsteps deliberate and calm. When she stood before Lily, she didn't raise her voice or make a scene. With the quiet strength that had carried her through all those years of hardship, Sophie offered her sister the simplest words, words that felt more powerful than any accusation could. "Congratulations, Lily." The words were not said with malice, nor were they said with false warmth. They were said with an understanding that Sophie had long since let go of any desire for revenge. The satisfaction of her accomplishments, the knowledge that her years of sacrifice had paid off, was more than enough. She didn't need to stoop to the level of petty revenge. Lily's response was a quick, nervous smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. The weight of Sophie's words hung between them, unspoken but clear. There was no longer any need for Sophie to prove herself. She had already done that. As she walked away from her sister, Sophie felt the deep satisfaction of knowing that the truth had a way of revealing itself, without any need for fanfare or drama. She had built her own success, and now, it was there for all to see. The night had already begun to unfold in a way Sophie hadn't expected, and yet, as the minutes passed, the truth seemed to grow harder to ignore. The ballroom, once filled with music and conversation, had taken on a new kind of energy, one that was thick with tension and disbelief. Sophie stood quietly, the weight of her years of silence heavy in her chest, as she watched the dynamics of her family begin to fracture. Lily, who had once been the golden child of the family, was now stumbling over her words as she tried to explain her career. Sophie could see the cracks in the perfect image her sister had built, the confidence faltering in her voice, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. It was a far cry from the poised, successful woman Lily had always tried to present to the world. Sophie's father, who had always worn the mantle of authority with ease, stepped forward with his usual air of control. His voice was low, but it carried the unmistakable bite of accusation. "You have no right to show up here," he growled, his words cutting through the air with a sharpness that sent a ripple of shock through the room. The guests around them hushed, the whispers growing louder as they tried to make sense of the situation unfolding before them. Sophie's parents were used to controlling the narrative, used to being the ones with all the power. But tonight, that power was slipping away. Sophie stood still, her heart pounding in her chest. She had always been the quiet one, the one who disappeared into the background. But now, in this moment, she knew she couldn't stay silent anymore. The years of being overlooked, the years of being told she wasn't good enough, all of it led to this point. She wasn't going to back down, not this time. Sophie stepped forward, her voice ringing clear and firm, cutting through the thick tension in the room. "I was invited here by Daniel," she said, her gaze steady. "My success is real." The words landed with the weight of truth, and for the first time in years, Sophie could feel the power in her own voice. The room seemed to hold its breath as the truth settled into the air, undeniable and impossible to ignore. Sophie wasn't the person they had always dismissed. She had built a life for herself, a life that was hers, not defined by her family's expectations or their lies. The energy in the room shifted. People who had once looked at her with indifference were now paying attention, their eyes filled with a mix of curiosity and recognition. But it wasn't just the guests who were changing. Sophie's parents, too, were beginning to show signs of cracking under the pressure. Her mother, usually so poised and controlled, was looking more and more uncomfortable, her hands fluttering nervously at her sides. And her father, the man who had always held the reins of their family with an iron fist, was faltering. The unspoken questions were growing louder. Sophie could feel them swirling around the room, just beneath the surface. Why had she been absent all these years? Why hadn't they known about her success? The answers were there, in the history of betrayal and silence that had marked her relationship with her family. But Sophie didn't need to answer them. She had nothing to prove to anyone anymore. As Lily tried to regain her composure, the cracks in her carefully curated life began to show. Sophie could see it clearly now the lies were catching up with her sister. Her story, the one she had built for so long, was crumbling. Sophie didn't need to expose her sister's secrets. The truth was already spilling out in the most unexpected way. Lily, the one who had always been the favored one, was now unraveling before the room. Sophie could almost feel a shift in the air, the power dynamics that had always been in her parents' hands now slowly slipping into hers. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about getting back at them. It was about standing tall, about owning the life she had built from the ground up. The truth was out, and Sophie wasn't afraid to face it, no matter how uncomfortable it made everyone else feel. In that moment, the power shift was undeniable. Sophie stood in the midst of her family's unraveling, steady and unwavering, knowing that she was no longer the person they had tried to keep in the shadows. The truth had found its way into the light, and Sophie was finally free. Sophie stood at the edge of the crowd, her heart pounding in her chest. The air around her was thick with anticipation, every whisper from the onlookers adding to the tension. For years, she had been the invisible one, the one overlooked and dismissed. But tonight, in this moment, everything was changing. She could feel the weight of her family's expectations, their judgments, and their deceit pressing down on her. But Sophie had long ago learned to carry that weight without faltering. The confrontation could escalate. She could stand up, expose the years of lies her family had woven around her, unravel the carefully constructed facade that had been built at her expense. But Sophie wasn't here for a dramatic revelation. She didn't need to make a scene. Her success spoke for itself. So, instead of shouting the truth, she chose to greet Lily, her estranged sister, with a simple, almost casual, "Hello, Lily. Congratulations." The simplicity of it hit like a punch. It wasn't the words themselves, but the calm delivery, the unspoken message that Sophie no longer needed to fight for recognition. She had already earned it. The room fell silent, the air thick with the weight of what had just transpired. Sophie, once the girl who had been dismissed, ignored, and rejected, now stood in the spotlight. There was no need for a grand speech or a dramatic reveal. The truth was clear, and Sophie was the one who held it. Power, control, and freedom. These were the emotions that flooded Sophie's chest as she held her ground. She wasn't waiting for her family's approval anymore. She wasn't seeking their validation. For the first time in her life, she felt completely empowered. It was as if a weight she hadn't even realized was there had been lifted from her shoulders, and she could finally stand tall, free from the chains of her past. As the silence in the room stretched on, Sophie's gaze flickered toward Daniel, Lily's new husband. His face, once filled with the glow of a newlywed, was now clouded with confusion. He had been listening to Lily's stories, her carefully crafted narratives, but now, something was different. Daniel had been caught in the web of lies, just like the rest of them. The calmness in Sophie's voice, the way she had carried herself, was beginning to unravel the story Lily had told him. The truth was slipping through the cracks, and Daniel was finally beginning to see the discrepancy between the woman he thought he married and the reality of who she really was. His confusion deepened as he realized that the woman he had pledged to spend his life with may not be the person she had portrayed herself to be. Sophie could see it in his eyes, a shift, a quiet moment of realization. The mask was slipping, and Daniel was starting to understand that the woman standing in front of him, the woman he had once believed was perfect, was not who she seemed. Sophie's gaze never wavered. She had no need to explain herself or to make him see what was so painfully obvious. The power, the control, the freedom were all hers now. She had spent so long hiding in the shadows, trying to meet the impossible expectations of her family. But now she was standing in the light, and nothing could take that away from her. The unexpected shift was subtle but powerful. Daniel was no longer the confident, assured husband. He was now a man confronted with the truth, caught between the woman he thought he knew and the reality of the situation. And as the room continued to buzz with whispered questions and uncertain glances, Sophie remained calm, unshaken, knowing that her journey was no longer tied to their lies. For the first time, Sophie felt what it was like to truly be herself, to live without fear of their judgment, to stand tall in her truth, knowing that she had built her success from the ground up. It was a victory not over her family, but over the version of herself they had tried to create. And that, she knew, was the greatest power of all. As the evening wore on, the tension in the air seemed to shift, taking on a new weight, a new understanding. Sophie stood at the edge of the ballroom, her gaze drifting toward Daniel. He had been a part of her life for only a short while, a newlywed caught up in the whirlwind of family expectations and unwitting deception. But now, as the layers of her past began to unfold, Daniel was starting to see the woman in front of him in a way he never had before. His confusion was giving way to something else: empathy. He had listened intently as Sophie's story started to come to light. Not through her words alone, but through the quiet strength she exuded. Daniel, who had always seen her as the confident CEO, was beginning to understand the depth of her past. Sophie had worked 3 jobs to put herself through school. She had financed her education, all while balancing the crushing weight of rejection from the very people who should have supported her, her family. She hadn't been handed her success. It had been earned through sleepless nights, countless sacrifices, and the refusal to let anyone dictate her future. As Daniel processed this new information, a wave of empathy washed over him. The woman standing before him wasn't just the CEO of MedTech Solutions. She wasn't just the woman who had revolutionized the field of surgical recovery. Sophie was a survivor. And now, for the first time, he saw her for who she truly was. Not just a businesswoman, but a woman who had fought to rise from the ashes of a life that had constantly tried to keep her down. The realization struck him hard, as if a veil had been lifted. Sophie had built an empire from nothing, all while being denied the love and support she deserved from the very people who should have lifted her up. She had faced hardships most people couldn't even imagine, and yet she had kept moving forward, never looking back, never asking for help. The weight of this knowledge settled heavily in Daniel's chest, and he found himself filled with awe not just for her accomplishments, but for the resilience it had taken to get there. But despite the sympathy that had begun to bloom in his heart, Sophie didn't seem bitter. She wasn't looking for revenge, nor did she want to expose her family's lies in some grand confrontation. The power of her presence alone was enough to leave them exposed. Instead, Sophie simply smiled, a calm, composed smile that spoke volumes more than any words could. "I'm here because I earned it," she said softly, her voice steady and firm. Her words hung in the air, carrying with them the weight of a lifetime of struggle, sacrifice, and strength. There was no anger in her voice, no bitterness, no need for validation. She had nothing left to prove, nothing left to fight for. Sophie had already won. She had built her life, her career, and her success, all on her own terms. And now, for the first time in her life, she didn't need anyone else's approval to feel validated. Daniel stood there, taken aback by the simplicity of her statement. He had expected some sort of emotional outburst, a flare of anger or a declaration of revenge. But Sophie had done something far more powerful. She had chosen peace. She had chosen to stand in the truth of her own success, knowing that her accomplishments spoke louder than any revenge ever could. The room around them continued to hum with whispers, but Sophie was no longer a part of that noise. She was a woman who had found her own voice, and she had nothing left to prove. Daniel's admiration for her deepened, and with it, a sense of connection blossomed between them. He had been blind to her struggles, but now he saw her clearly. She wasn't just the woman he had married, she was someone far more remarkable. In that moment, Sophie realized something else. She no longer needed the approval of her family, her husband, or anyone else. She had come into her own, and for the first time she felt free, truly free, to live life on her own terms. As the evening stretched on, Sophie could feel the weight of the night slowly lifting from her shoulders. The gala, with all its glitter and grandeur, had been a battleground, an unexpected war of emotions, lies, and family dynamics. But now, the tension was beginning to ease, and the moment had come to leave it all behind. Sophie glanced down at her son, Ethan, who was tugging at her hand with an eager smile, his excitement palpable. "Pool time, Mom!" he exclaimed, his voice filled with innocent joy. The world outside the ballroom seemed to call to him, and Sophie found herself smiling, the overwhelming weight of the evening's events momentarily forgotten. With Michael by her side, his steady presence grounding her, Sophie took a deep breath and nodded. "All right, buddy, let's go." As they stepped out into the cool night air, Sophie felt a wave of relief wash over her. The grand doors of the ballroom closed behind them, cutting off the noise, the whispers, and the expectations that had plagued her all evening. The tension that had gripped her chest throughout the night seemed to evaporate in the quiet of the night, leaving behind a profound sense of peace. The drive home was filled with the soft hum of the car's engine and the warmth of her son's excited chatter about the pool and the adventures waiting for them. Sophie's gaze drifted to Michael, her partner in both life and this monumental moment. His calm demeanor, always supportive and unwavering, had been the anchor she had needed all night. They didn't need to speak, it was enough to know that they were together, and that their family, though small, was strong and united. In that silence, Sophie realized something fundamental. She had reclaimed her own narrative. After years of being overshadowed by family expectations, lies, and betrayal, she had taken control of her own story. The future ahead of her was no longer defined by the people who had tried to keep her down. As they arrived home, Sophie's mind drifted to the night's events, still processing everything that had happened. She was finally free. Free from the need to impress. Free from the desire to seek approval from people who had never truly supported her. Sophie had made it. She had built her own life, and now, the future was hers to shape. Later that evening, as Sophie sat quietly in her office, sorting through paperwork, her phone buzzed, drawing her attention. She picked it up, expecting another message from one of the medical professionals she had met earlier. But instead, her screen displayed a familiar name: Lily. For a moment, Sophie hesitated. After everything that had happened, she had expected to leave her sister and the past behind her. But curiosity won out, and she opened the message. The message was brief, a stark contrast to the drama and tension that had unfolded between them all evening. "Sophie, I know I can't undo the past, but I need to tell you I'm sorry. I made mistakes. I lied. I hurt you, and I don't expect you to forgive me. But I hope you can find it in your heart to move on. I was wrong. Lily." Sophie sat back in her chair, stunned. The words seemed so simple, yet the weight they carried was undeniable. An apology, a confession of the lies, the mistakes, and the hurt caused. It was unexpected, especially after everything that had happened. Sophie had spent so many years believing that Lily's world was perfect, that the lies her family had told about her were untouchable. But here, in this moment, Lily was acknowledging the truth. Sophie's heart was heavy, and she felt a strange mix of emotions: shock, relief, and, for the first time in years, hope. For a moment, Sophie considered her response. The years of pain, the lies, the betrayals. Could she forgive Lily? Or had the damage been done beyond repair? She didn't know. What she did know was that she had come too far to let anyone else dictate her life. Sophie had learned that forgiveness wasn't always about letting others off the hook. It was about letting go of the weight of the past for her own peace of mind. The decision was hers, and hers alone. With a quiet sigh, Sophie typed a simple reply. "Thank you for your apology, Lily. I'll think about it." As she put her phone down, Sophie knew that whatever she decided, it wouldn't define her future. She had already built something of her own, and whatever came next, she would face it on her own terms. The night may have ended in a quiet way, but Sophie knew this was just the beginning of the rest of her life, and she was ready to embrace whatever came next. Sophie stood in her office, her gaze fixed on the $12 million partnership contract sprawled across the desk in front of her. The sleek, bold signature at the bottom of the page signified a monumental achievement, one that marked the culmination of years of hard work, sacrifice, and resilience. The journey had been long, filled with obstacles, heartache, and betrayal. But standing here, in this moment, Sophie felt an overwhelming sense of triumph. This wasn't just a business deal, it was the physical manifestation of everything she had fought for. Her eyes traced the lines of the contract, the numbers and figures barely registering as her mind drifted back to the path that had led her here. The path that began with rejection from her family, a family who had never believed in her. Sophie had been dismissed as the failure of the family, cast aside in favor of her younger sister Lily, who seemed to be everything Sophie wasn't. The years spent in silence, building her own empire, had been fueled by the belief that she was meant for something more than the small, suffocating world her parents and sister tried to trap her in. But now, with this contract, Sophie realized just how far she had come. It wasn't just the financial success that mattered, nor the acknowledgement from industry leaders. It was the fact that she had stayed true to herself, that she had built something from nothing, and that she had done it all on her own terms. She hadn't needed their approval, their validation, or their support. Sophie had forged her own path, step by painful step. And now, standing at the summit of her journey, she understood something profound. Family doesn't always define you, your actions, your heart, and your resilience are what shape who you are. Her hand brushed the edge of the contract, a symbol of her perseverance. A small, satisfied smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. In the past, the thought of this moment would have been a fantasy, a dream that felt too far out of reach. But now, it was real. Sophie had made it. She had built a company, created life-changing technologies, and earned the respect of those who had once turned their backs on her. She had taken the pain of her past and transformed it into something powerful. As she stood there, a quiet reflection washed over her. She thought about the years of hardship, the late nights, the moments when she had questioned her worth and whether she was making the right choice. There had been times when the weight of it all felt too much to bear, when the memories of her family's rejection, their lies, and their hurtful words threatened to crush her spirit. But Sophie had survived. She had risen above it all, and in doing so, she had learned something invaluable. The greatest victory, Sophie realized, wasn't just in building a successful business or securing lucrative contracts. It was in the ability to walk away from the things that didn't serve her, the relationships that weighed her down, and the people who had failed to see her worth. It was in knowing that she didn't need their approval to feel complete. She had always been enough. Gratitude flooded Sophie's heart as she looked back at the journey she had traveled. She wasn't the same person she had been when she left her family all those years ago. The pain had shaped her, yes, but it had also strengthened her. She had learned to trust in herself, to believe in her own worth, and to find strength in the face of adversity. Sophie took a deep breath, a quiet sense of peace settling within her. She wasn't just walking away from her past, she was walking toward her future. A future she had created with her own two hands. A future filled with possibility, with success, and with the knowledge that she had earned every bit of it. This was her moment, and it was just the beginning. Life is a journey filled with challenges, setbacks, and moments of doubt. Yet, it is in overcoming these obstacles that we discover our true strength. The story of Sophie is a testament to the power of resilience and self-worth. Throughout her life, she faced rejection and betrayal, yet she never allowed those experiences to define her. Instead, she used them as fuel to build a successful future, not only for herself, but also to help others. The lesson here is that we are not defined by our past or by the people who fail to recognize our worth. True success comes from within through determination, hard work, and staying true to our values. It teaches us that even when life pushes us down, we have the power to rise again, stronger and more determined. For those of us in the later stages of life, it's a reminder that it's never too late to redefine ourselves, to pursue our dreams, and to find peace with who we are. Our worth is not determined by others' opinions, but by our own actions, our ability to stay true to ourselves, and our capacity for kindness and empathy. Life is not about perfection. It's about embracing who we are and continuing to grow, no matter the stage of life we are in. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to give us a thumbs up and subscribe to Silent Wars for more inspiring content. Your support means the world to us.